Thank you so much to Abigail for becoming Yellow of the Egg's first ever patron. I really appreciate your support. If you want to join Abigail and become a patron of the show, go to patreon.com/Yellow of the Egg. Link is in the show notes. Idioms are some of the best things about a language. They're often unique, untranslatable, and sometimes just plain strange. German happens to be rich in weird and wonderful idioms. The name of this podcast comes from one of them, das Gelbe vom Ei. Today's guest has brought along a bunch of German idioms and expressions, some being specifically Viennese, and some not being specific to any particular region. And in this episode, we'll hear all about them. We're going to hear about what these idioms mean, where they come from, and when you might use them. And at the end, we'll also hear a couple of her favourite English idioms too. Content warning: when discussing one particular idiom, we briefly mention a meaning connected to the Holocaust. You can check the show notes for when this part comes up, in case you need to skip over this section. So, let's get straight into it. Let's crack on with the show. This is Yellow of the Egg, the podcast where we tell the German language to throw itself over the houses. I'm Luke Green, and this is Series 2, Episode 10, German Idioms.
An idiom is a phrase that has a different meaning than the words actually have. So the literal meaning is a totally different one than that of the phrase. And it's also very language specific. So it depends on which language you use. And it's always just peculiar to that particular language that you're using.
This is Vanessa Krebs. She's Viennese and she's a teacher here in Vienna. Of the idioms that Vanessa brought along today, some of them can be considered specifically Viennese, or at least dialectal in the sense of not belonging to the standard variety. This has an effect on the situations in which you're likely to hear them, and Vanessa wasn't always allowed to say them all.
If I had used them as a child, my mum would have gone mad. No, you don't use these kind of words. She would always say that. My mum always said, you're not supposed to use Viennese dialect. You should always speak High German. You should, not use slang terms and whatever. She was very strict about that. So if I wanted to achieve something, if I wanted to talk to a person, I should speak appropriately. In German, she said, schön sprechen, which you cannot really translate. It would sound like speak beautifully, but, use appropriate words, terms that people understand regardless where you're going. And she always thought it wouldn't make a good impression if I used dialect phrases.
This isn't to say that all German idioms are inappropriate. There are many idioms that are completely harmless, but many are considered dialectal and therefore not appropriate for certain contexts. And of course, some might come across as a little rude or too familiar in the wrong company. You might come across as being impolite. And speaking of politeness, this brings us on to the first idiom that Vanessa brought along. And this is perfect for me as an Englishman.
It's called nicht, feine, englische sein. And how could you translate it? That's not proper English manners, probably. But what does it mean? It means basically you should have been more polite, you should have been more considerate, you should have handled the situation a little better. And then we say, but das ist nicht die feine englische Art if you don't do that. So if you're rude, if you're direct, you say, oh, that's not, how the English would do it, probably.
There goes English again with its reputation for being polite. But this phrase isn't just a comment on how English people are in general.
It refers to fair play in British sports because people kind of were envious about, how people stuck to the rules. I don't know if they stick to the rules anymore, but in the past they used to. And it's kind of a hint to British sports and fair play. So that's why they used it. It doesn't have to do anything with manners or something, with people talking to each other, but more with how they behave in tournaments.
As with all etymology and language history, we have to take everything with a little pinch of salt. Even if the origins of the phrase might not directly be to do with manners, that's certainly how it's used nowadays. For example, you could say it if someone said or did something that was quite abrupt or rude, like if you say hello to someone and they just scoff and walk away.
Or if people break up and then they complain about how the person broke up with them, you would say, oh, das ist aber nicht die feine englische Art. For example, if they broke up by sending a text message or something, you would say that. Or maybe if people just don't conform to, the norms of behavior, you would say, das war aber nicht die feine englische Art. You wouldn't say that to their faces. You would probably say that behind their backs.
Not even the way you use the phrase is direct. It's actually like being English on the meta level by not expressing it to people's faces. Most people who speak German will have probably heard this phrase before and will know what it means. Though you're quite unlikely to hear young people use it that often, if at all.
If you ask teenagers, they go, never heard that before. They have their own language. They teach me some terms and phrases that I would never have used in any context.
For instance,
I decided not to give them homework one day, and they were so excited, and then one of the students came up to me and he said, Frau Fester, Sie sind eine Ehrenfrau. Sie sind Ehrenfrau. Not eine, but Sie sind Ehrenfrau. And I looked at him frowning, so, what do you mean? I'm a woman of honor? What should I? No, it was a good move of you not to give us any homework, so that's why we call you Ehrenfrau. Okay, right. Ich bin Ehrenfrau. Obviously, that's the way you call it. Ehrenmann is also there, so, yeah.
Ehrenmann and Ehrenfrau were the official youth word of the year in Germany in 2018. It essentially means man or woman of honor, and the way it's used among young people nowadays seems to be attributed to the hip-hop scene and has made its way into mainstream youth language in German. Woman of honor, that's quite the accolade.
But only if I not give them homework. If I give them some homework, I'm not Ehrenfrau anymore.
What if the teacher sets some homework but the students don't do it? Vanessa has a good expression for this scenario too.
That one I picked because my German teacher used to say it all the time, and now I know why she did actually, because I looked it up. She said whenever we forgot some homework, so we were reading a book, for example, and we had to read chapters so and so and so, and then she said at the beginning of the lesson, okay, be honest, so who's read chapters X, Y, and Z? No one raised their hands, and she was like sighing and saying, ich kenne meine Pappenheimer, ja. Which means I know my people, I know what to expect of them, I know what's to be expected. And I was always, why are you saying that? And I know there is a Pappenheimgasse in the 19th district, so I thought this has to correlate in some way.
And it does. There was a person called Pappenheim after whom this street is named. Vanessa did a bit of investigating as to who this Pappenheim person was.
And I found out it was a general of the Holy Roman Empire, and he fought in the 30 Years' War. He used to know his regiment, so he was called Count Pappenheim, and his regiment, they were Pappenheimer. And so when he said, ich kenne ja meine Pappenheimer, so he knew they were loyal, they would kind of stick to him, whatever happens.
So when you say this about your students, you're actually calling them dependable. You can rely on them not doing their homework.
I mean, I also use that sometimes when I write to the parents and kind of have to write, well, your son hasn't brought or your daughter hasn't brought any homework again. And I would say, ich kenne ja meine Pappenheimer. I know they've got a lot to do. They've got a lot on their minds. And it's not really something that you would use in a bad way. So it's more like, I know what the person is like and I'm patient, but I also want to say, no, this has to stop now. It has to go in a different direction. So that's when you use it. Ich kenne ja meine Pappenheimer.
This idiom could translate roughly to something like, I know them so well, or I know them inside and out. You know who you're dealing with and you know what to expect. This phrase is pretty much universally understood to have this meaning wherever you go. It might have slight nuances, but people will generally know what you mean when you say it. The same can't be said for our next phrase.
Wie die Faust aufs Auge.
Like a fist on the eye. How delightful.
Germans know that as well as the Austrians do, but it's supposed to mean different things, and I looked it up.
Vanessa comes from Austria, where the phrase means that things go together perfectly. Everything works out just the way it should. It matches. It's compatible. It's the perfect fit. In Germany, it can have this meaning too, but it can also mean quite the opposite.
But I was always wondering, why do the Germans say wie die Faust aufs Auge and then mean it doesn't fit at all? Or it doesn't rhyme if you're writing a poem, or it's just completely the opposite of what it's supposed to be. Then they say wie die Faust aufs Auge. And I was always confused because when we say in Austria wie die Faust aufs Auge, then it means it fits. Everything's falling into place. Things rhyme. So I was wondering, why do they use it in the wrong context? By wrong, I mean what I thought of that.
I guess it depends on whether you think a fist in your eye is a perfect fit or not. If we take this as an Austria-Germany difference, Austrians seem to think a punch in the face is a good thing, while Germans don't seem to like it that much. The phrase doesn't seem to have been quite so controversial back in the 15th century, when it had the meaning that something isn't right or something doesn't go together.
So people used to write poems, and then they said, this is wie die Faust aufs Auge, meaning, oh, it doesn't rhyme, it doesn't sound good, you have to kind of rephrase that. And then someone used it in an ironic kind of way, meaning, well, it's okay, it fits, and that's the meaning we seem to have incorporated or used.
The ironic meaning seems to have come about around the 17th century, and has stuck to this day. Nowadays it belongs to a growing list of contronyms, that is, words or phrases that have multiple opposite meanings. In German they're known as Januswörter, from the Roman god Janus, who was depicted with two faces. You might also hear contronyms being referred to as Janus words in English too. Think of words like anhalten, which can mean both to stop and to continue. Remember we heard the example grundsätzlich in Series 2 Episode 5, with the meanings in general with exceptions and as a rule without exceptions. The phrase wie die Faust aufs Auge is one such contronym. So confusing and illogical that a phrase would have two completely opposite meanings.
Yeah, I was stunned. We didn't have German television when I was a small child. We started getting that when I was about 10 to 12. And then I heard it sometimes and I said to my mum, wait, that's not right. Why is he saying it that way? It means a completely different thing.
Of course, German has to have a phrase that has the opposite meaning of itself. It has to make things more complicated than necessary. There is another phrase that's quite fitting in this context.
Yeah, this is very, very Viennese. Mach keine Fisimatenten, which means don't make things more complicated than they should be.
Are you listening, German? Are you?
My mum used to say that to me when I was a small child and I took ages to do something. She said, mach keine Fisimatenten, mach jetzt bitte endlich weiter. And I had to look that phrase up because when I was typing in the word Fisimatenten, I wasn't even sure how to write it because I've never written it down anywhere.
Check the show notes for the spelling. You could translate Fisimatenten as shenanigans or fuss.
And then I kind of tried it, and it said actually that it comes from Latin visamente, or is it Italian? I don't know. And it refers to the ornaments that noblemen drew on their coat of arms. And they became very intricate and very complicated because people wanted to show off how important they were. And then at some point, someone must have said, please, let's not make it more complicated than it should be. And that's how Visamente became Fisimatenten. Apparently.
Kind of ironic that German would make a phrase meaning, don't make things more complicated than they need to be, and it does that by making a word more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, this is kind of a tongue twister, because I wasn't sure how to write it even. I've never seen it anywhere in writing. Anywhere. But people say it. My grandma used to say it. My mom used to say it. Their friends used to say it. They don't say it anymore, but these are the kind of things I think they should definitely be revived and used so that people understand, okay, it might be a difficult word, but I know what it's about.
This is not the kind of phrase you'd be likely to hear young people say. You wouldn't hear it in the classroom at school, for instance.
Definitely not. No. They would kind of frown at me and, oh, she's using strange words again. A strange teacher using strange words again.
Let's say, for instance, you ignore the advice to keep things simple and not make them more complicated than they need to be. If you make things difficult and convoluted for yourself, German has a phrase for that too.
If you do things in a very complicated way, or if, let's say, you have to go from point A to point B, and you're taking the longest, most winding kind of route you could think of, then you would say, du gehst mit der Kirche ums Kreuz.
You're going with the church around the cross.
Meaning, this could have been achieved in a kind of shorter way. So instead of taking the cross and rounding the church, you would take the church and round the cross. Meaning it was too complicated. Why did you do it that way?
For example,
I kind of rented a car and wanted to go to I don't know where. And it took me ages to get there. My mom said, du bist mit der Kirche ums Kreuz gefahren. Why did you do that? It took me 20 minutes to get there. It took you 50. What did you do? Where did you go? And this is where you use it. It has its background in those religious processions. Probably they took the longest winding routes mankind could ever think of. I don't know.
Imagine the church in this context not to be the building itself, but the congregation. The procession wouldn't take the quickest route in a straight line, but would take the indirect way with many detours. You might hear another phrase in German with a similar meaning, mit der Kirche ums Dorf fahren. So imagine going all around the village with the church congregation. Not to be confused with the similar sounding but quite opposite phrase, die Kirche im Dorf lassen, a phrase that took me a long time to get my head around.
It took me a long time to understand that too, because it's more German. So, for example, if you're talking about a specific topic and you're kind of trailing off and talking about something else, or things get blown up out of proportion, then you would say, okay, lassen wir die Kirche im Dorf. Meaning that's actually difficult to say. Meaning we should stick to the main points. We should go back to where we started from.
So going back to our congregation and the church parade, we can parade around the village, meaning we make things more complicated. Or we can leave the church in the village, die Kirche im Dorf lassen, and keep things within reasonable boundaries. We avoid exaggerating. If you didn't know, these phrases were originally referring to the congregation and not necessarily the church itself. It sounds a bit like you're picking up the whole building and driving it around a village. Or maybe there actually used to be mini portable churches.
That's an interesting concept for all of those listening. Portable churches. In COVID times, more important than ever. Why not?
From moving buildings around to throwing yourself over them now. Here we have 3 phrases that all pretty much have the same meaning.
Sich über die Häuser hauen, sich putzen, sich brausen gehen. That means the same thing.
Here are their literal meanings.
So sich putzen would be to clean oneself, which doesn't have anything to do with hygiene, but that's what it is. Sich brausen gehen would be to take a shower, and sich über die Häuser hauen, well, that's a bit difficult, because literally it would mean to throw oneself over houses. And this is a concept that's very hard to grasp if you're trying to, picture that. And it means just, please go away, or I'm going away, in not a very nice way. So if you say to someone, putz dich, it's not a very nice way of saying, please go away now. Or geh dich brausen, or hau dich über die Häuser. It's more like a command than...
It's like telling someone to get lost, but instead telling them to get clean, or throw themselves over the houses. It's not the nicest way to tell someone to leave. It can be quite rude, but it's not typically aggressive.
There is not too much anger involved. It's more tongue-in-cheek, again. And the same is with putz dich and also geh dich brausen. It's not really, people are not really angry and showing their fists and say, please leave. They try to tell you, okay, now it's annoying, probably, please go away, kind of thing.
You can also use hau dich über die Häuser in the first person.
Exactly. Ich hau mich über die Häuser, you can also say that. Just to inform you I'm going now. That's what it would be, but most of the time it's to tell somebody else just to leave.
There's one important thing to bear in mind when it comes to one of these three phrases. Putz dich and hau dich über die Häuser are a bit impolite, but they're relatively harmless. Geh dich brausen, on the other hand, has acquired some problematic connotations.
That could be a bit difficult nowadays to use that phrase, because I once read in an article in der Standard that if you think of the Holocaust, you shouldn't use geh dich brausen, because that has a very, very horrifying meaning then. If you think of that era and what happened, that has acquired a new horrific meaning then.
If you think of geh dich brausen as meaning go and take a shower to mean go away, you can see what's implied here in the context of concentration camps. The deadly gas that was used to kill millions of people, the vast majority of them Jews, was often expelled from showerheads. This even spawned the abhorrent saying, geh dich brausen nach Mauthausen, Mauthausen being where more than 100,000 people were murdered. The phrase geh dich brausen was already in use before the time of the Holocaust, so it wasn't invented by the Nazis as such. It's often attributed to the language of football games. If you're told to go and take a shower, you're being told to get off the field and leave the game. But the phrase adopted a new, heinous meaning in the light of the Holocaust, and this ought to be considered carefully.
People say you should, abstain from using that, you should be more sensitive. And I never thought about the phrase that way. Really, I used it innocently, and it shocked me that, this could have actually that meaning as well. So I was really horrified.
This connection is not necessarily in the general public consciousness, and many people still use it without intending to allude to the atrocities of the Holocaust. It's not as easy as to say that a phrase should be banned because of such a connection, but if you really want to tell people to get lost, there are other alternatives, such as the ones we've heard, like hau dich über die Häuser. They're just as rude if that's what you're going for, but they come with a lot less acquired baggage and don't have this added layer of meaning. There are many other words and expressions whose meanings have changed and which have become very problematic due to their use and connection with the Nazi regime, but this is for a future episode when we can devote more time to it. For now, let's hear about one more German idiom, and this one is a particularly Austrian one. You won't believe this, but in Austria, you're not just able to plant trees, you can actually plant people.
Jemanden pflanzen.
To plant someone.
This means you do not plant anything, and I'm not good with gardening either, so that would be totally misplaced, but it means, are you kidding me? Are you pulling my leg?
You would say, willst du mich pflanzen? Which means, do you want to plant me?
I'm using it all the time, to be honest. And I'm also using it when I talk to my pupils at school. And when they hand in homework late, or if they don't hand it in at all, or if they hand it in on a torn piece of paper, I say that to them. And they don't know it, and they start laughing. And then they say, was sagen Sie mir, Frau Professor? Sie wollen mich pflanzen? And I say, no, du willst mich pflanzen, not the other way around. So they start laughing about the phrase, but they know what it means now because I'm using it. And my mom uses it and my cousins use it. So basically my whole family uses it. And it's a nicer way of saying, are you pulling my leg?
You might compare it to the phrase, willst du mich verarschen?
Yeah, but I wouldn't count that as Viennese dialect because that's more German. I think that's what they use. And that's one of the phrases also that my mom would have very much disapproved of when I was a child. Now I'm using it all the time, but still, as a child I wasn't supposed to. It's like, what have you just said?
Jemanden verarschen is sometimes considered a bit crude. Jemanden pflanzen is a bit nicer.
You could use slang terms, you could use derogative language, but I think that's just a nice way of saying that.
An example of when you might use this.
I'm asking a person to bring along a cake, let's say, and the person comes along bringing a piece of broccoli.
A situation I'm sure we've all encountered before.
It's a bad example, I know, but I would stand there and say, willst du mich pflanzen? Are you kidding me? You were supposed to bring a cake. So this is the kind of context that I could think of.
I asked for cake and you brought broccoli. Do you want to plant me?
Do you want to plant me? Yes. No, I'm not having this broccoli. I want cake.
It's usually meant in a bit of a jokey way, though.
You're not really angry. Although I'd be angry if someone promised me a cake and brought along broccoli. I'd be angry, I guess. I don't know, it's like, what, you're really doing this? I can't believe it.
Vanessa also brought along a couple of her favourite English idioms too, and her first one continues the cake theme.
For example, if you say it's a piece of cake, that's always nice to me. I love cake.
We all love cake on this podcast.
But why does it mean it's easy? It's a piece of cake. I mean, it's delicious, but not easy. If I'm trying to bake a cake, it's definitely not easy. The end result may be great or not, but it's not easy.
I mean, I guess it could be referring to just slicing the cake or eating the cake.
I don't know. I mean, I love it just because I love pastries and cakes, and it's totally up my alley. But yeah, why does it have to be easy? Say, you'll pass the test. It would be a piece of cake. No, piece of cake is something different. Give me the cake. Forget about the test.
If only it was a real piece of cake.
If only it was. But I just love that everything with desserts is my thing. So it's a piece of cake is definitely one of my favorites.
I think you can tell from the enthusiasm towards cake that Vanessa has a bit of a sweet tooth, which incidentally is the second English phrase she brought along.
To have a sweet tooth. That refers to the cake as well. I mean, I chose it because there is no equivalent in the German language. If you try to translate it, it wouldn't make any sense. Ich habe einen süßen Zahn. Huh? I've never looked at your teeth, so I don't know. So, yeah, I don't know. You could say, if you like pastry in Vienna, you could say, ich bin ein Mehlspeis-Tiger.
Which is like, I'm a dessert tiger, which I actually like a lot more.
That would practically mean the same thing, but there's a tiger and there's a tooth. These are very, very different things.
Other ways you could express having a sweet tooth in German?
You could only say, ich mag Süßigkeiten. Ich stehe auf Süßigkeiten. Ich bin eine Süße. Ich esse gern Süßes. But that's not nearly as creative as saying I have a sweet tooth. It's not the same thing. So that's why I chose it. That's why I like it so much, because there is, again, no equivalent in the German language. And that's why I like English so much. There are so many funny things in there that do not have an equivalent in any kind of way. And I'm thinking like, we could be so much more creative in German, but we're not.
I don't know, German's creative. At least it seems to like picking up churches and carrying them around the village.
I know, not many people do that, but the German-speaking people do that. We can move churches, but I'd rather talk about cake. I'm in the wrong country. I can't eat in church, there's no chocolate. No country for me.
Before we get too stuck on cake again, let's hear one more English phrase.
The last one is also food related, even though there's no pastry or sweet kind of thing in it. It's called as cool as a cucumber. And, you know, of all the things in the world, if you told a person, please put another word after that, as cool as, I'd never, ever think of a cucumber. I think of many things as cool as, but not a cucumber. I mean, nutrition-wise, fine, perfect. It might be cooling, I don't know, but it's not cool. And it always puzzled me. My teacher, when I was 14, my teacher kind of introduced me to that phrase, and I said, no way. Why? Ich bin so cool wie eine Gurke? No, in German it doesn't even make sense.
Petition to get the phrase so cool wie eine Gurke in the Duden.
I told my teacher, I don't believe people use that. It's not made up, but maybe people have used it in the past and do not use it now. And then I went to London and heard somebody say that. And I said, no way. They're really using it. And I thought this was kind of made up. So, yeah, maybe they do have this thing with cucumbers. You know, there are cucumber sandwiches. Maybe, I don't know.
Cucumber cake?
Oh, no. Oh no, that sounds too healthy. No way.
So of the phrases we talked about today, what's your favourite?
I'd say, maybe jemanden pflanzen oder willst du mich pflanzen? Because you can still use it. It's just so common still. And it's such a peculiar way of saying, are you pulling my leg? By the way, why are we pulling legs? I don't I don't really, understand why.
It's a fair point. And what about your favorite English phrase?
I think as cool as a cucumber made me laugh. That's why I think I have two. And the second one is a piece of cake, of course. Has to be a piece of cake. And then people should really come up to me and explain to me why it's easy to, I don't know, if you pass something, why is it like a piece of cake? Because it's so pleasant? I don't know, probably.
Idioms don't make sense. If you go back and look at where they originated, things start to fall into place. When you realize that mit der Kirche ums Kreuz fahren refers to a church congregation and not the church building itself, it does start to make a little more sense. But what we're left with today are people being planted, desert tigers and fists in your eye. Idioms certainly make languages more opaque, and to learners perhaps even more complicated. But languages are far better off for them.
They add that kind of spice to a language.
Oh, spice. Back to food.
Otherwise they would be boring, I guess. But of course you have to be responsible and you have to think about, are these still appropriate idioms that I'm using or are they offensive? So you should definitely, think about that before using any of those. But they do have a historical background in most cases, so they are just part of language, and without them, a language would just be plain boring. Could be any kind of language we could invent. So this is something that adds a bit of spice to it.
Thank you so much to Vanessa Krebs for joining me for this episode. You can find the list of the idioms mentioned in today's episode in the show notes and on the podcast website, yellowoftheegg.com. Remember, you can follow the podcast on Instagram at YOTE that's YOTE podcast, Facebook at Yellow of the Egg, and you can send me an email at yellowoftheegg.podcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the podcast further, you can become a patron at patreon.com/yellowoftheegg. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes bits and bobs, and they help to keep this independent podcast going. If you can't afford to pledge, that's absolutely fine. I would really appreciate a 5-star rating and review, and I would love it if you would recommend the podcast to a friend who needs a bit more German in their life. Thank you for your support. So with all that being said, thank you so much for listening. Playing us out this series are Euphonics, this time with Burning on Fire. Check them out on Spotify, links in the show notes. Enjoy the song, and I'll see you in the next episode. Ich hau mich jetzt über die Häuser. Macht's es gut. Servus aus Wien.
Can you show